Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. That was an incredible overview, and it's so exciting to hear everything you're doing. And I'm so fortunate that we have you at my institution, UNC. We actually, I think we first met realizing we know the same bladder cancer patient advocate in one of our cancer outcomes group meetings. But anyways, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience, because I think it's really helpful just to hear, you know, how it can be done and all the different options and avenues to do it. And so I am a researcher, and I'm going to share very briefly my own experience with engaging patients on teams. Not all researchers engage patients on their teams, but I think that it's very valuable, and I'm going to share my experience with it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk about the patient perspective, since we have worked very closely together. Let's see. I don't know if my
you should have your mouth, Angie. There you go.
Oh, there it's going. It's going now. It was just a delay. So I like to start with this quote because this is, I think, this question, which was posed back in the mid-90s, is really what sort of took off in terms of the patient-centered outcomes research movement. And the question is, would researchers be helped to do more relevant research if the public became more involved in planning and promoting research? And I think it was like the, well, duh, yeah moment for me to think, why don't we have a patient at the table helping us first make sure we're asking the right question, and two, if we are asking the right question, are we studying it the right way, or are we making sure we are looking at the outcomes that matter the most to patients who are impacted by the disease? There's been this growing body of evidence that patient engagement has been taking off, particularly in the research world, and that came about with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute and many other things as well. But I do think that this funding organization funded specifically research that was patient-oriented, patient-centered, and they were very big, and they still are, with regard to engaging and involving the patient in the entire process. And you can see that just taking off over the last decade. And so you can see back in between 2017 and 18, over 200 PCORI-funded projects have been completed, and that number is actually moving up very rapidly. So there's been a continuum of involvement in terms of patient engagement and research just in general. So initially, research was researcher-led. There's consultative, where patients would inform research through some discussions or maybe some listening sessions. There's collaborative, where the partnership is actually a part of the research team. So it's inclusivity on the research team, meaning that when I, as a researcher, am sitting at the table with my statistician and maybe with another researcher, or maybe with another urologist, I also have a patient there at the table with us, all of whom have an equal say in what we're designing and what we're doing. And then it can go all the way to the other side of the spectrum where it's patient-led, and there's a lot of great studies that have examples of that as well. So the way that studies are, or at least large studies in particular, clinical trials are designed, is that there is an overarching organization system. So you have the executive committee, and then usually you'll have 3 coordinating centers going from right to left, not left to right on your screen. You have the data coordinating center, that's like the statistics and the number crunching. The clinical coordinating center, which is, getting the data from clinical sites and things of that nature. And then there's the stakeholder coordinating center, and that's where I, as a researcher, engage with patients. And in my particular study, which I'll just talk about very briefly in a moment, we have a national advisory board so that we can disseminate the results of the study effectively. We have a patient advisory board, which you're going to hear a little bit more about from Bob. and then we have a clinician advisory board. But all three of those are incredibly important because we need to have everyone at the table so we better understand how we can have success with that particular clinical trial. And there's a lot of engagement techniques. I won't belabor the point because I want to have time for questions at the end, but there are a lot of engagement techniques to get patient input, and they can range from interviews to focus groups to meetings and surveys, etc. And there's lots of evidence for the fact that having patients engaged in a team can improve the study. I am a big believer. Like Stephanie always says, I'm definitely drink the orange Kool-Aid, orange for BCAN, of course, but on patient engagement and research. So we have study development, and we have, at least in my studies, we have patients assist with selecting the topic and prioritizing how important it is, informing how we design the study, how we select the outcomes, and then moving into how we recruit patients and how we retain them. Who better to ask than a patient? How do we analyze the data? And then how do we disseminate it to the community, and how do we interpret it? Because we want to make sure that not just researchers read it, but patients, of course. Again, this seems like an obvious thing, but I don't believe this is how research was done in the past, and we're trying to change that. And so I do believe, and I have seen this absolutely, that having a patient on my team has improved the quality of the patient-facing materials they get when they are looking at joining a clinical trial. It informs how the patients access their information, and it has changed how researchers, including myself, communicate about the findings, and all of those are so important. So as a very brief overview of what we've done, and there's been a lot over the last 5 years, we have had several engagement awards. This is funded by PCORI, and if you heard Stephanie at the very beginning, this webinar series is funded by a PCORI Engagement Award. This is the third one. But the first one was a patient survey network where we recruited patients around the country to get a sense of what research questions are really unanswered. What should we be studying as researchers? And who better to ask than a patient who has been impacted by bladder cancer? The second engagement award, and this is probably relevant to many people who are listening to this webinar, is how do we empower patients to become engaged? Because it's hard if you have never really dipped your toe into research. What does that mean? And so we created a way in which, if you have no experience at all, but you have an interest, you can actually self-train through a series of modules. And so we, when we partnered together, we partnered, of course, with BCAN because of their wonderful advocacy in the area of bladder cancer. And it just kind of created and developed organically. From a research standpoint, I felt that it was the perfect place to put this together, because BCAN has always incorporated patients and brought together patients and caregivers and researchers. And I think that it was just a natural place to almost test or organically grow this patient engagement mindset. And so we did that when we made, I guess it was about 5 years ago, and we were fortunate to get that first engagement award, and things took off from there. But I will say that there were very uncertain expectations at the beginning, because again, this is not how research has been typically done. But with time, we've really developed a really good process, and over time, we've really grown the peer program, the program of research advocates, quite a bit over time. And this webinar is one of the ways in which we will hope to grow it further. So if you're someone listening who you've never done it before, this is for you to know that you're welcome. We want to have new people who don't have experience, because we know that you can do this, especially if you have the drive and motivation to give back in that way. But certainly, yes, there's some gaps between the researcher and patient, but we've been able to, I think, successfully bridge those gaps. So in terms of the activities that we've done, we have the annual think tank, which is for the annual scientific meeting of BCAN. And then we created an online curriculum that I just mentioned. We also have these leadership summits that are annual as well. And I would encourage you to look into that, because that's another place where we delve into research advocacy. And from there, we actually had held some monthly working group calls, and we talked about grant writing, where we can get funds to basically fund our research. We created some surveys, and we talked about some research design. And one of those developed into a clinical trial that has now been funded. It's a $3 million PCORI-funded trial, answering the number one question voted by patients with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, which is, what do we do when BCG no longer works? And that compares surgery with medical management or intravesical therapy. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because Bob is one of our patient advocates on this study on our advocate advisory board. So I'm going to leave it to him to talk a little bit about that. There we go. But really, what I wanted to say very briefly is this was a patient-informed research question, and from patients, we actually published an article in Cancer that goes through all of the most important questions, and PCORI saw that, and for the first time ever, bladder cancer was listed as one of their 18 key priority areas. So it really gave us an avenue to get funding, or at least have a chance of getting funded, and we used that to inform the study. We then went back to patients who were in that first cohort of asking, what would you prioritize? And we asked them about the design. Would they be willing to sign up for a study in which you would get one of these two treatments? And the majority of people said yes, but really what it came down to is they wanted to have the choice of which one it would be. And so that was a really important piece of information so we could design a study. The other thing that came up was the most important type of outcomes to study. And of course, survival and spread of disease came up, but also caregiver burden, financial burden, and many other outcomes that we ended up incorporating into the study. And so this is what the study design, the clinical trial, looks like. Patients for whom BCG stops working, they choose whether they undergo surgery to have their bladder removed or some kind of bladder sparing treatment. And then we look at 12-month quality of life. We look at survival. We look at decisional regret, financial toxicity, which is the cost of the treatment, and healthcare use. So all of these derive from patients. And Bob will discuss, again, the patient perspective on this. But again, this partnership has grown tremendously over the last several years, and I anticipate this will continue to grow as we get more patients interested and involved in this type of involvement, in this type of advocacy, which is different, but some really feel very passionately about it. And certainly expectations have changed over time, but really the proof of our success has been that we've been successful in getting grant funding, which means that we have money to answer these important questions. We have grown stronger through the think tank, through video conference calls, through these types of webinars, and creating that connection. And with regard to our partnership and funding, so one of the working groups with other patient advocates has designed and a potential grant for looking at improving discomfort related to cystoscopy. And PCORI is actually reviewing that on Monday, this Monday. So fingers crossed, because we'll have our results at that point, and we'll share that back with everyone. And then another one was the impact of bladder cancer on caregivers, and I'm actually resubmitting that grant to the National Institutes of Health March 5th. So really, we have had proof and evidence based on that funding. And I do believe that the potential value for patients have been immense. I know as a researcher, from my perspective, it has really clarified and streamlined my research. I really feel very strongly that what I do is important and is really answering the questions most important to patients. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Bob, that was a little under 15, but I try to be quick. I'm sorry.